welcome to another edition of MCC Briefing. I'm so glad you joined us today. This is our Canada Day special, and we're glad you're part of it. We would encourage you to call in during the show at 587-741-3031. 587-741-3031. You can call anytime. You'll enter our queue. We'll have you right here. We'll call in studio. And as soon as we get around to you, we'll greet you, ask you your name. We just ask to keep your comments respectful and polite. Get to your point right away if you can. Feel free to make comments. We're all about free speech and declaring our thinking and to think things through together and become more a part of a community together as we explore the things that are true, real, good, moral, and right. We discuss those together. So MCC is a production of Millerville Community Church, and we're here to encourage you, to build you up, to keep you informed about what's going on at Millerville Community Church and around the world. We've already talked about other places in the world like India. We've talked about local issues, and today we're going to talk about Canada Day. Canada Day is a real important day in which we celebrate our nation. Last year we did a special on Canada Day, and we're going to do that again today. But we're also going to bring you up to speed with some of the real challenges that are taking place in our world today and how that is affecting our understanding of Canada and who we are as Canadians. And I don't know where you stand on that. If you're a recent arrival to this country or you've been here all your life, maybe your ancestors have, but Canada Day is a special day where we consider who we are. Give us a call at 587-741-3031, 587-741-3031. It's the same number every week we get on. Tuesday is our show, 11 to 1. You can put this in your speed dial and be able to call us at 587-741-3031. It doesn't matter where you are. You can call from your car, from your work, from your home, outside, inside. You've got a mobile service. You can also watch us live on YouTube, Facebook, as we are live right now every Tuesday, 11 to 1 o'clock. And you can watch this show later. It's saved on those channels, so if you want to share it with someone else, you can do that and say, hey, you missed the show, but it was a really great show. I think today is going to be a really great show. But I want to let you know, you're the one that makes this show great by calling 587-741-3031, 587-741-3031. And there are a lot of people, I got to tell you, who are nervous about calling and talking. And if you could just know that you're just talking to a friendly guy, that's me. You're not going to be threatened in any way. We're going to listen to everything you want to say and help you think it through, too. So there's no problem with that. I want you to feel relaxed. You can call anytime. 587-741-3031. Today we're looking at Canada Day and the effects that has on our nation, the current turmoil we're experiencing in our country as our nationality, our citizenship, and who we are as Canadians has been greatly questioned. You might remember a year ago at this time, we saw assaults on historical sites of Canada, the tearing down of statues, throwing paint on John A. Macdonald, and now that has continued on. They've attacked Churchill and the Queen and many others. And if it's a statue, it's going to get attacked. So what is going on in our country? Why is there, we hear the Prime Minister apologizing for our country, but we've seen this around the world in other countries, whether in the United States or Canada. There's an embarrassment about nationalism, about being proud of our country. And so we want to talk about that today because Canada is a great country. I was raised here and love Canada. I'm Canadian by choice and American by birth, but Canadian by choice. And I love my country that I've chosen to be a part of, as many people of you who also chose to be Canadian. Mind you, there are times when you wonder, where have I come to? I thought Canada was this certain kind of country, and now you wonder if it's the country you thought it was. And it's been changing. You might have lived here all your life and realized it isn't the same country that you recognized long ago. What's been going on? Well, I want you to know it's not just a Canadian thing. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in Germany. It's happening in England. It's happening in Canada, in the United States. All over the face of the earth, countries are beginning to question who they are, their borders, their nationality. And there is being encouraged to have a sense of guilt about our nations and to beat ourselves up and not to be very proud. Well, frankly, Canadians were never really that proud of Canada. That's only been a fairly recent thing. We've been a rather humble, modest people, trying to do good and keep our affairs in order. And we have done well sometimes and not well sometimes, but we certainly didn't go around bragging like the Americans did. That's what we always thought is virtuous about Canada. And now we're told to be ashamed. What do you mean ashamed? Well, I don't know if you've been watching the news, but here's a news story to catch you up to speed on what people are thinking about Canada Day, which is tomorrow.
It would be reprehensible to celebrate Canada Day.
Calls are mounting to cancel our country's national celebration in the wake of the discovery of the remains of 215 children at a former Kamloops residential school. Indigenous proponents say moving forward with Canada Day glosses over the discovery and our nation's real history.
Do we live in denial and dance on the bones of children and pretend nothing is happening? Or do we take responsibility and comprehend the genocide that has been perpetrated against Indigenous people since the birth of Canada?
And I just hope that on Canada Day, everybody take it upon themselves to celebrate it in their own way.
Others say Canada Day events can still be held while paying solemn tribute to lives lost and impacted.
If you are holding your own events, that maybe you might want to invite a First Nations person from your community or from your territory and say, will you come and welcome us into your territory?
It causes on our committee a lot of reflection to go, you know what, maybe this is the year that we need to just pause.
So far, a handful of communities have cancelled Canada Day events, including Victoria, BC, and Wilmot Township in Ontario. Instead of cake and games, children in Wilmot are painting tiny maple leaves as a gateway to a conversation about colonialism and Indigenous history.
Some children have painted them orange with the obvious connection to what's been going on with the Indigenous community. Some have said, you're loved. Another one says, this land is for everyone.
But as the hashtag Cancel Canada Day continues to trend on Twitter, Indigenous leaders believe more communities will trade in maple leaves and fireworks for something more respectful.
I think that we'll probably see more of that. I don't think that you'll see too many Indigenous people waving the flags around on July 1st.
Ultimately, it remains to be seen how many communities cancel Canada Day. Regardless, the day takes on even more meaning for the Indigenous community this year, dealing with pain that has only been amplified in 2021.
To reclaim the day, maybe bringing out their own flag, their own Indigenous colors, wearing their ribbon dresses, carrying their drums, singing the songs that they have been given the right to sing.
Scott Frolick, City News, Edmonton.
There you go. Twitter crowd calling social media, cancel Canada Day. That's this coming tomorrow. A lot of people have been for over a month now. Many have been calling for the canceling of Canada Day. And cities and different regions have individually decided to do exactly that. Well, is it an issue? Should we be embarrassed as Canadians? Should we stop and mourn and reconsider our colonial past and whether Canada is really what we thought it was? And what are we going to do about that? Well, the leader of the Conservative Party was watching all this about canceling Canada Day, and this is what he had to say. Whoops, here we go.
Someone who served Canada and will soon ask for the trust to lead this country, I can't stay silent when people want to cancel Canada Day. We are not a perfect country. No country is. There is not a place on this planet whose history can withstand close scrutiny. But there is a difference between acknowledging where we've fallen short. There is a difference between legitimate criticism and always tearing down the country.
So, the leader of the Conservative Party says, no, we shouldn't cancel Canada Day. We shouldn't be tearing down the country, tearing down statues, and doing these kinds of things. What do you think? Give us a call at 587-741-3031. 587-741-3031. Are you going to celebrate Canada Day? Are you going to get together with friends and celebrate our country and what it's about? Or are you going to just let it slide, not do anything because of embarrassment about mistakes that our colonial past has made? And Canada was a colony of the British government and under British rule for quite some time. And we honored the Queen, we honor the country. Still to this very day, the head of state is the Queen of England. And politicians honor that every day. They go into Parliament. We sing God Save the Queen. We are part of our colonial past. But was England all bad, or was it also good? Was England practicing slavery? The answer is yes. Was England abolished slavery before the United States had a war over it? The answer is yes, they did. They abolished slavery before the Americans, and that included Canada. So yes, we're not perfect, but have we been working to make the world better? The answer is absolutely yes. So should we be embarrassed as Canadians, or should we also celebrate the great accomplishments and the things that Canada has done? Give me a call, 587-741-3031. Let me know what you're going to do for Canada Day. Are you embarrassed or proud to be a Canadian? 587-741-3031. This question was asked of a national poll. It came out from the National Post, and they heard the call on social media to cancel Canada Day, but they found out that after they took a poll of the average Canadian, rather than going to social media and finding out what social media said, they said, well, what do most Canadians say? And the answer is that the vast majority of Canadians disagree with canceling Canada Day in 2021. So no, most Canadians want to move ahead, have the fireworks, do the parades, do it all. There's no need to cancel. There was only about 14% of the Canadians back some move to eliminate the national holiday. There wasn't a real solid backing at that. It was only some. So, and even then, it was a pretty light backing of that. It says the results when the poll responders were asked, do you feel that the questions about Canada and its historical record, it would be best to cancel Canada Day this year? And the pollster of Ledger says, honestly, it didn't surprise me that much. That I often do see these surveys that the general public is occasionally out of step with what might often see is the groundswell on social media. I could say the groundswell on social media is often out of step with the general public opinion. It's interesting he worded that way, that the general public's out of step with social media. So is social media going to lead us, or is the opinion of the general public going to lead us? Are we a democracy still? Or do we let the loud voices on social media to dominate? I would suggest the latter is true. We need to let the general population determine the country's direction, rather than a few people that are getting some views on social media. The poll surveyed 1,542 Canadians between June 18 and 20. Amongst the respondents, fervent support also came for the Canadian flag. 69% said they want to see the Canadian flag displayed more often in more places. So conversely, a mere 11%, not 14, 11% said they worried about the display of the flag lest it offend marginalized groups. So it's a very small percentage of Canadians that actually agree with social media. Now, I want you to know, you wouldn't know that from the newscast that I showed you a little earlier. They were trying to influence the vast majority of Canadians that are just ready to roll with the parade and with the flags and with the fireworks for Canada Day. Get together with friends. We're looking forward to it. Here in Alberta, we get to, we've been promised by the Premier, and right now my staff is monitoring the Alberta site for the actual code restrictions and health restrictions, but we've been promised January 1, all restrictions are off. Well, we're going to believe it when we see it. We're monitoring it closely, but tomorrow, January 1st, Canada Day, we can celebrate, get together with friends, not wear masks, have a barbecue, have a wonderful time in the beautiful outdoors of Canada, outside of Calgary and the foothills of Alberta where we are, and we can get back to normal. In fact, we're looking forward to wide open. You don't even need to pre-register to come to church on Sunday. No masks, no restrictions. That's what we've been promised. That's what we hope is going to take place. We're watching it very closely. So we're looking forward to what Premier Kenney called the best Canada Day ever. So because of the lifting of restrictions. So should we listen to social media? Because it looks like the news media is listening to social media very closely, and it seems like they want to push us in a certain direction. I don't know if you've noticed that over the years, that social media has become influencer on media, more so than what the Canadian population thinks. Where there's this big push to change us, to move us more to the left, more to social justice and these kinds of issues. And social media is pushing hard and using it to influence in that direction. But frankly, most of the population just isn't there. We're not agreeing with it. You might temporarily for most part, but our attitude is very different. And there is the cancellation thing that's going around too, where people are being removed from YouTube, Facebook, their voices are being silenced because they're not in agreement with the 14%. And they're told their views are offensive and they are then removed because they're not reflecting a certain agenda. And this is a very real thing. Could happen to us with this show. We could be canceled at any time because if they find don't match up to their algorithms and that they disagree with our worldview, they could cancel us. And that happens all the time. It's happening in the news media, but it's a small segment of the population that is doing this to the majority of us. And that is very troubling because that is a threat to our country and who we are as Canadians and how we understand ourselves. There are bullies in the room, and they're affecting us. One of the most famous people who has stood up to the bully of media and social media and mainline media, CBC and so on, is Rex Murphy, who himself was on the CBC for so many years and then finally left that. He's been going out on his own, and you might be finding it hard to hear from Rex Murphy. I found this interview with Rex Murphy asking him questions about his experience with the CBC and the cancel culture. The cancel culture, interesting enough, Rex Murphy has framed it as a new religion. And being a person who practices in the realm of church, I'm a pastor at Millerville Community Church, I think it's really important to pay attention to when someone says there's a new religion out there, and I would describe it as a new religion. It is looking to gain disciples, to evangelize, and to convert, and to make you a part of that. So we've got to be very careful about this new religion and our experience of it and what it's going to be doing to our country. Here's Rex Murphy on the new religion of the woke culture.
It's a way of morally distinguishing. It's a shallow religion. It's a false religion. It's a fraud religion. But the mentality behind it is, if I have this view on X or Y, this is the sacred view. This one came down from the mount that was inscribed on the tablets. Now you poor fool, you've been thinking about it for yourself, and your opinion is different from mine. But I'm the virtuous person, and you're the absurd, malignant clown that has a different view than me. So you got to be stopped. I have to be hailed. And internally, it is the sanctimony and the righteousness of people. It's a secular doctrine.
Now, Rex is making an excellent point. He says there is I've heard other people put this forward too, that we are being discriminated by 14% of social media and of the population and mainline media that is following that by saying you can't believe that, you can't say that, you're a poor, ignorant fool. We know what's true and what's real and what's right, and you need to listen to us. And if you disagree with us, then you can't speak, and that's what happened to Rex Murphy. Let's hear more from it.
Hard left politics is a doctrine as much as any dogma of any church, of any faith whatsoever. But this is a crucial point. It's only in the last 4 or 5 years in the West where we are reputedly free that this push to have one-dimensional thought. Not only do you not argue with me, I insist that you endorse the view you deplore. I'm tired of cliche comparisons to George Orwell in 1984. I'm tired of them. But you know, it's probably the only one that's there. Truth is false. Why are people who are advocating with such ferocity, such lunatic views, given such authoritative presence? And you have it even in the States with the great riots that are going on. The number of people getting killed in the riots is more than the number of people they're alleging were killed. But to say these things, as Jordan Peterson said about pronouns, or as Stockwell was arguing that maybe bullying is not a problem confined just to race. I can go on and on and on. I have never seen in the universities, in the corporations, in the professions, this idea of putting your hand on your own mouth, because the person next to me may have one of those right opinions. And if he or she hears me saying something, then you go to the internet and you howl on Twitter, and you have what's the equivalent of a metaphorical lynching. How many people's careers have been collapsed because some crowd of anonymous mob strikes all of a sudden at once, simultaneously, and then the corporation apologizes?
He's got an excellent point. There's been many occasions in which people's careers have ended. There are organizations, news media, like Rebel News. If you go right now to YouTube and try to find them, I haven't seen them on YouTube. They've been warning that they're going to get canceled on YouTube. I believe they have. So careers have ended, like Rex Murphy. He's gone off and done his own thing, and there are many others around the world who are being silenced because they hold the wrong point of view. Well, in a free society, do we want free speech? Do we really want that? And this becomes the problem. Free speech is the cornerstone of a free society. It doesn't matter if it's offensive or something like that. The point is to allow for that freedom. Bad ideas won't get attraction as long as they're put in contrast to good ideas. So let's have an open debate, and that's why we have this show, where you can call 587-741-3031. 587-741-3031. And give us your opinion. We want to hear from you. We don't want it just one way. We want it both ways. We want to hear, do you agree? Do you disagree? Should we be ashamed of Canada? Should we not be ashamed of Canada? Rex Murphy is just saying the woke crowd, 14%, will say, no, cancel Canada Day. But most of us aren't that. Most of us are for Canada Day. And should we just, because we don't share in the self-righteous opinion of some people, do we have to follow what they say? Now, in all of that, it's important to understand that as we share opinions and we're in this social dialogue with another, that we treat each other with mutual respect and dignity. That's a part of good dialogue, and that's what we encourage here. If you call in 587-741-3031, we don't want to call people down. We want to understand where the other person is coming from and then discuss that based on principles and truths, not just on feelings, but on reality. What really is going on here? What is taking place? And is it happening right now, or is something that happened in the past? Does it help us to relive that, or do we put that within context and understand it in a different way? We have to have that conversation and not just shut down people because they're not in agreement with the woke crowd that is out there. And Rex Murphy has certainly been in disagreement with that crowd, and he has experienced the consequences of that. He calls it repression. And repression is when you are not allowed to say what you want to say and believe, where we don't allow free speech and we're told to be quiet. Put a hand over your mouth and be silent. Well, you can only do that so long. It doesn't work forever. Repression is not going to keep working, and this is what Rex has to say next. Let's hear from him.
Canadians and Americans and Western Europeans have been drawing this little blind over what they really think and feel, and then there comes an explosion. At some point, repression doesn't work, and we saw that example in Brexit. There's a whole lot of people out there that don't think like you, but because they're feeling the shame that comes over them from the left, they decide to shut their mouths. Well, that only lasts so long, and then you have political response.
One of those main issues, you brought up a whole slew of them where this is obviously happening, is this whole kind of claim that Canada is a systemically racist, apartheid South Africa, and you, I feel, were the first person to stick their neck out on this topic, and you got rebuked. I know Conrad Black did as well, and he lost a radio appearance or something.
Oh, yeah, there's all sorts of things.
And you kind of got rebuked by your own paper that was publishing you. Can you kind of talk about what you wrote? Because I read it, and I shared it, and I thought, how could anyone disagree with this?
It was an innocuous opinion. So there was a storm of a sort. I don't mind arguments, so I did. I really did say to them both, go ahead. Print another. That's the point. I didn't jump on my critic, and I certainly didn't try to have any penalty attached. I let it ride. On the internet, I think I got swaddled across the head a few times, but who cares? I mean, the opinion of a Twitter mob is not beneath contempt. It's in some other room altogether. One point I will make before we leave it off: we all have opinions. Most of us are not extremists. There are bigots in Canada. There are bigots in Newfoundland. There are bigots in Nigeria. There are bigots in China. It's a part of the human element. But to suggest that by far the majority structure of the country itself has a hostility to one particular segment of the Canadian population is a slander and should not be allowed to stand. The curiosity about mine is the one that you picked out. That was an innocuous opinion. I didn't mention any names in it, so you didn't have that personal byplay. And I just pointed out the obvious. We are welcoming. We have a very progressive immigration policy. We offer health services whenever we can. We participate in international efforts to other countries than our own. We welcome the Vietnamese immigrants. That was a big one. The small towns of Newfoundland, one of them I lived in, 500, 600 people. Now, there might have been rough words, but we're a welcoming bunch. And if you went down 10 years later, you'd see this. No, don't slander your own country.
And I think you kind of pointed out, if Canada in 2020 is a racist country, what isn't?
Yeah, what isn't? Anyway, I won't bring up the counterexamples, and I won't bring up the horrors of Nazism and totalitarianism. There have been really deep, murderous policies in the last 100 years of countries that actually subscribed to evil systems. And over here, we almost got to find something to fight about. We got to stir up the dust merely to throw it at each other. If you had a history of Albania or Romania or any of the Eastern Bloc countries or East Germany, you wouldn't be worried about whether you should use a double pronoun, and you certainly wouldn't be energizing Twitter mobs to attack other people because of grammar or the weather. So no, we're not.
So, no, we're not. He says we're not racist, we're not oppressive, we're not. We're just not. He says the track record of Canada is really great. We are one of the most welcoming, caring countries in the world. That's who we are right now. And so we've been people will try to shame us, guilt us, say, there you are, you're at fault. The truth is, no country is perfect, as was stated earlier. But in comparison to our past and where we are now, we're getting better every day. We're better all the time. And we love the world, and we're doing our best to be good citizens of the world. But we are Canadians, and we're not ashamed of it, nor of our past. We shouldn't just tear down the past because it is a painful memory to some, but to continue to learn and to grow and to do what is right in the eyes of God. And I think that is the main point. Well, that's where we're going to turn to next as we look at what it means to be a nation. And I want to go a little further than this. Wanted to hear from you at 587-741-3031. You can call in anytime. All lines are open, 587-741-3031, about how you feel about your country. Canada, are you embarrassed by Canada, or do you love your country? It is said that there are three things that are needed by any country in order to survive and to prosper. Three loves that every country has to have. It doesn't matter which country you're talking about, but it has to have a love of God, a love of your neighbor, and a love of your country. And if you don't have all three, you can't just have one or two. If you don't have all three, your country's not going to make it. Love of God, love of neighbor, and love of your country. And those three things are under attack today by social media and a whole bunch of mob. And we're wondering, well, what is this small group and why are they attacking these three loves? And why are they trying to tear down our country? So we would love to hear from you. We're going to go dive a little deeper into this issue by looking at a thing called the Truth Project. We're going to give you a time to get ready. Give the courage, give us a call at 587-741-3031, where you can be a part of the show. Give us a call at 587-741-3031. I hope you're getting ready to call as we dive just a bit deeper into this whole issue about country, nationality as Canadians. Why is it all under attack? Why are the three loves? Love of neighbor, love of country, love of God. Why are these three essentials to any country under attack? Well, that's what we want to look at today. Several years ago, Focus on the Family put out a video series called The Truth Project. It was probably one of the best things they ever did. And they did a lot on the family and so on, but this great series talks a lot about foundational issues that we are facing today. And what they cover is almost prophetic in the light of where we are today. And especially of what just happened in Parliament this last week. And I'm going to get to that towards the end of the show. But I want to lay the issue before you by going back to some fundamentals about our foundation of our country and who we are and how we think of ourselves and how all of the foundations are under attack and are eroding away. And if we don't think clearly on these things, we can lose everything. So the Truth Project is a part of that. You can Google Truth Project, look on YouTube for it, and you may be able to find some videos so that you can catch up on that. I think after you see the segment I'm going to show you, you're going to find it very interesting. Here's just the layout of the what it's like. So. So this is going to be in a classroom setting. The teacher is instructing students like you would at a university. And you saw the opening scene there. I don't know if you recognize that, but that's a famous painting of Pilate and Jesus Christ before the crowd. They're yelling, "Crucify him." And the big question that Pilate asked Jesus is, what is truth? So that's why that's the main image that we have here about what is truth and what is it about and what is the Truth Project. This is lesson number 8 or 9 in the series that we're going to look at. And we're jumping along to government and how it operates and its secular nature. You can give us a call at 587-741-3031, 587-741-3031 if you want to comment on that. You might even want to jot your thought down because this might trigger quite a bit for you. This is a little segment from it. I'm going to let this roll, make a comment on the other side. So Truth Project, the secular. Yeah, made a mistake. Here we go. There we go.
All right, we're going to examine a behemoth of an institution, the state. And it could well be that this is going to be a tour in which you're going to find yourself conflicted. This is the tour where we find that a lot of students end up finding out that they have been taken captive by the world. So, I love this tour, but you may not. So we're going to begin by looking at a definition. Politics, the science of government, that part of ethics which consists in the regulation and government of a nation or state for the preservation of its safety, peace, and prosperity, comprehending the defense of its existence and rights against foreign control or conquest, and the protection of its citizens in their rights, with the preservation and improvement of their morals. Isn't this interesting? This definition talking about the issue of the state, politics, that begins by saying it's that part of ethics and ends by saying with the preservation and improvement of their morals. I don't know that people today would say that the state has any vested interest in either of those. But we're going to find out it has a great interest in them as well. Now, I have a question, an ethical question, since we are going to deal a little bit with ethics in the beginning. What is stealing? What is the definition of stealing?
Taking what's not yours.
Taking what is not yours. Okay, so stealing implies that there is ownership of property. And taking that from someone who owns that property is called stealing, right? Now, let me tell you a little story. See if we can kind of clarify this issue just a little bit more. Story of James and Heidi. James and Heidi married young. James loved farming. Heidi loved farming. And the Lord blessed them in that effort. They rented some land, and as God blessed them, they had the ability to be able to purchase some land. And over time, as God continued to bless them, they ended up with a fairly large farm. He also blessed them with children. Now, Heidi and James had a farm that you would call a picture farm. It's what you would dream about or think about if you pictured a perfect farm somewhere. A great family. Well, a tragedy occurred, and James and Heidi were killed in an auto accident. Now, Heidi's sister flew in to take care of the children in the midst of this tragedy, and while she was there, shortly after their death, there was a rumbling outside, and the door burst open, and a gang came into the house and began to take things. They began to take half of everything. Half of the stuff in the house. They pulled up a big truck. They began to take half of the cattle, half of all of the implements, and roared away. Now, would you call that stealing? Would you call that stealing, Lena?
I would.
You would. Would you call that stealing, David?
I'm still trying to decide what would I do. Yes, I would.
Yes, you would. Now, let me tell you that there's another piece of the story, though. What if I were to tell you that there was a reason that they took that stuff? What if I were to tell you that they needed it? You still say it's stealing?
Yeah.
What if I were to tell you that they needed the money because they had a sick dog?
Stealing.
Still stealing? What if I were to tell you that it was the governor?
Stealing.
What if I were to tell you that the governor passed a law that said he could do that?
Stealing.
You still say it's stealing? Well, do you know that we have a law like that in America?
Yeah.
That gives the state the right in certain situations to take half of a dead man's property? Is that stealing? These are serious questions. Because what we're dealing with in an attempt to try and understand this sphere that God has designed, one way to help understand this sphere is to ask boundary questions. Can the state steal? What do you think? Can the state steal, Joshua?
Looks like legally they can.
Legally they can. But let's talk about from God's perspective. God is the one who delivered to us the ethical notion of stealing, correct? Thou shalt not steal. The question before us is, can this sphere steal? Is it possible for this sphere to steal?
No.
No.
No. Well, you say no. Then that means the state can ethically come and take your car if they want today.
Unfortunately, that's true, yeah.
And you'd say that would not be ethically wrong.
Ethically, no, because it's not against the rules.
Well, the question is, before God, is it wrong? That's the issue. In other words, God is the one who said stealing is wrong. Can the state steal?
The state has entrusted the domain of not only its people, but of its assets.
So that you would say that the state owns everything.
No.
An issue here. An issue here.
Yeah.
Let's look at God's perspective for a minute. 1 Kings chapter 21. Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." So Ahab went home sullen and angry because Naboth the Jezreelite had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." He lay on his bed, sulking, and refused to eat. His wife Jezebel came in and asked him, "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" He answered her, "Because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, 'Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place.' But he said, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" Jezebel, his wife, said, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, "Proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people, but seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them testify that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death." So the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel directed in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, "Naboth has cursed both God and the king." So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, "Naboth has been stoned and is dead." As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead." When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up, went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Now, what do you think of Ahab?
Murderer.
A murderer?
He misused his power.
Misuse of power? How do we know that? We just got through the question of whether or not the state can steal. We could also the question, can the state murder? So here we have a situation where the king, the state, has now taken the property of an individual. How does God see this? That's what's important to us at this point, is it not? Let's read on. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. "Go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it. Say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property?' Then say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours.'" What did God think?
That it was murder.
He saw it as murder.
And stealing. And stealing.
He saw it as theft. So the question that we asked, can the state steal? I think the answer has to be yes. It can. In this case, God has now come to Ahab and said, the dogs will lick up your blood as well, as a result of what he has done. Who is this?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar. That is exactly right. You recall the story of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon? He was the ruler of the world. An interesting story that we read in Daniel chapter 4 about Nebuchadnezzar, because he'd had a dream. And if you recall in the dream, none of his wise men could tell him what the dream meant. Daniel came and explained the dream to him. And the dream, in essence, was a deep warning to Nebuchadnezzar. If Nebuchadnezzar did not recognize that God was the one who was sovereign over kings, then he was going to be driven away to eat grass like cattle. So that was a great warning to Nebuchadnezzar. I've always thought, boy, if that warning had come to me, I'd have remembered that the rest of my life. But let's pick up the story now in Daniel chapter 4.
12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes.
Now, the question is, who's really in control here? Who's really in charge?
God.
That's exactly right. The king of Babylon believed that he was the one that had created all of this. He was the one who had built all of this. And immediately, it says, when the words were still on his lips, he was driven away. Let's continue.
At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?"
What we are interested in here is to understand what this sphere looks like. What kind of design has God implemented into this social system? Where do we go? Well, we've already begun to look at a few of these passages. Let's look at a few more. Proverbs 16, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. A divine decision is in the lips of the king. Proverbs 21, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. Daniel 2, he changes time and seasons. He sets up kings and he deposes them. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you and that my name might be proclaimed in all of the earth. So, what is before us is the question, what does this sphere look like? What should I put in this sphere?
A king.
A king? Where should I put the king?
In the middle.
In the middle. What else is in this sphere?
The people.
I'm going to say and agree with you that I am convinced that God is the one who has placed himself in this sphere. And I believe there is a reason for it. The reason is this. This sphere can become the most terrible monster of all. And I think that is the reason why God continues to remind the king that he is subject to God. He is not the sovereign ruler over the world, but he is subject to God. What else is in this sphere?
People.
The people.
The people. And here we have this multiple member, the citizens. And we have a relationship between them. So let's begin to look at this and examine what this sphere looks like, the roles and responsibilities that are within it. We're going to have to turn to another passage to help us. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 8 for a minute. I want to ask this question, why did Israel ask for a king? Let's look at this passage and we'll ask ourselves, why did Israel ask for a king? When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Why did they ask for a king? Andy?
Because their leadership was going south.
That's exactly right. The form of government, their leadership was corrupt. And so what they were doing, they were coming to change the form of government, the form of leadership. What was the form before?
Judges.
Judges. The form before this? Judges. They wanted to do away with that form, and they now wanted a monarchy. So Israel asked for a king because of the corruptness of the judges. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they've rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now, listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." So what God is saying, He said, okay, I'll give you another form, but I want you to know what that form is going to look like. A warning. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots." This is going to be huge. "He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants." Now, what did that mean to the people of Israel when God warned them and said, He will take the best of your fields?
You're going to bake first fruits.
The first fruits. Who did they belong to?
God.
They belong to God. This guy is now going to demand what is God's. And what is he going to do with them? Redistribute those. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. What did it mean for the king to now take 1/10?
Taking their tithe.
The tithe. And again distribute it to those who are supporting him. Your men servants and maid servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. Now, I know this is probably hard for you to imagine that the state would take 10%.
Follow me.
Interesting statement, I believe, by God, who is warning them what this government will become. A behemoth that will take the best, your first fruits. It will take 10% of your goods. It will redistribute your wealth to others. A warning. You will become his slaves. Well, this raises an interesting question. Is the king sovereign over every other sphere? In other words, when we look at these spheres, is the state sovereign over the rest of these social institutions? This question is a question that Abram Kuyper dealt with, and he crafted a term called sphere sovereignty. Let me explain what that means. Sphere sovereignty, in essence, says that if God created each of these spheres for a purpose, He designed them, He created the members, the roles, responsibility, and why they exist, then Kuyper's position was this. That means that these other spheres are sovereign in that purpose. It doesn't mean that they're sovereign in the way we use the term sovereign of God. But in their sphere of what God has created them to do, they are sovereign. So the question here is whether or not the state then, in its role and responsibility, has sovereign rule and control over these others. We're going to look at one more story and read God's perspective on what it means for the king to begin to assume that he has authority over another sphere. So let's take a look at it. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. I think this is one of the saddest chapters in the Bible. Then all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in place of his father Amaziah. And then the rest of this chapter is talking about the incredible things that Uzziah did. It says, as long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. Verse 4 said he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, there are not many kings of whom that is stated. So here we have this incredible young man who reigns for 52 years in Israel, doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord, commended. And then the chapter tells about all the things he did. But then we get to verse 16, and something happens. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest with 80 other courageous priests, and they must have been courageous because the king has the power to put you to death in many cases. Courageous priests of the Lord followed him, and they confronted him and said, it is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God. How did the king respond to this? Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry. It is not surprising when the king becomes powerful and someone challenges his authority and rule that he will become angry. Uzziah had a censer in his hand ready to burn incense, became angry while he was raging at the priests in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple. Leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah the chief priest and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous and excluded from the temple of the Lord. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. He lost his rule. And then it ends by saying, the other events of Uzziah's reign from beginning are recorded by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. Uzziah rested with his fathers and was buried near them, not with them, near them in a field for burial that belonged to the kings. For people said he had leprosy. And Jotham, his son, succeeded him as king. Is this fair? Great king, good king? Wasn't he just trying to do something good here? Isn't it good to burn incense? What is the issue? Why did God respond the way he did? This idea of sphere sovereignty is critical to God.
So I've given you a lot to think about. There was a ton of great and important truths buried in there. You may have to go back and watch this again to catch everything that is there and look up those scriptures and consider it. But what is being put forth here is that the biblical worldview about God believes that God is sovereign over all things, including governments, and that our rights and our privileges and what we're able to do is based on what God gives us, not the government, what God gives us. If we remove God, if we say he no longer applies, and this is what our modern day government calls secular, is that there is no God, and we don't consider God when we make decisions, then they have overstepped, like this king we just heard about and many others. And they are acting like God. They're taking on the role of God. And that becomes a serious problem for our country. There was a time when we honored God. We knew who God was. It was in our national anthem. We asked God to save our queen, and we had a general sense of morality of what is right and wrong, what is correct in the courts, and all these things because of our belief in God. But as we remove God from our thinking and no longer respecting him, then all that goes out the window, that common understanding of what is good and right, what is of noble purpose, and how we should behave to one another. Now, there are a lot of people who will point out that Canada hasn't always been a great country, that we have made mistakes. Yes, that is true. Every country has. But the question is, whether you're a good person or a bad person is about what are you pursuing, the evil thing or the good thing. I expect all of us to mess up, all of us to have faults. Would you agree? Is anyone perfect? No. If Canada is a racist country, then what country is not racist based on that? We have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None are perfect. Even those who accuse others of being racist are racist. We are all falling short of the glory of God. So our purpose is not to say one person is better than another, but that in rejecting God, we remove any restraint that is upon government and the way they behave. Now, this can happen in church. This can happen with religious organizations. They can say that they love God, but if they disrespect God and don't take his word seriously and don't obey his commands, they too are stepping into the realm that belongs to God and acting like God, determining things for God when they do not have the right nor the responsibility to do so. So governments can act this way, churches can act this way, church groups can act this way, the Catholic Church can act this way, the Catholic Church has acted this way, large denominations have overreached, and it goes on today. And there are many times that you will find people on TV and radio and other places speaking for God things that God has never said, nor does he agree with. The question is there a God that holds the church and the government and every social institution accountable? The answer is yes. There is consequences to these decisions. Unfortunately, the rest of us will suffer. Then the point is not to get away from God because some religious group failed or some government failed, but to get back to God so we can do better, so we can learn from the mistakes of those in the past and to avoid those errors in the future by letting God be God and not to assume his role in our life. Let's roll on with the Truth Project.
I don't know if you all still watch cowboy movies or not. I think cowboy movies got a lot of stuff right. Do you know what I mean by cowboy movies, westerns? Okay, good. Let me describe a scene for you and let's see if you can catch how well cowboy movies get this stuff right. All of a sudden, here's a scene. Someone is being chased through town by a posse. And the individual who's being chased comes around the corner, stops in front of the church, jumps off his horse and runs into the church. The posse comes around the corner, screeches to a halt. Well, horses don't really screech to a halt. Stops. What does the posse do? Do they rush into the church? No. Isn't it amazing how we all know this intuitively? Why do they not rush into the church? Because early on in the life of this nation, when we set aside a town and set aside in that town a place for a church, that church did not sit on Texas soil. It sat on God's soil. And the Texas Ranger had no jurisdiction there. We understood the idea of sphere sovereignty. Something has changed. Something drastically has changed. So here is this design of the state, and I'll leave it to you to spend the time looking at it and studying the passages in the Scripture to help understand how God has designed this social system. We'll look at a few, and we're going to look primarily at one passage, Romans chapter 13. We're going to deal with the issue of the delegation of authority and submission and the purpose of the sphere, and we'll try to draw from Romans 13. Let's listen to it.
Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong.
Okay, let's stop for a minute. What are some key words in this passage?
So, the classic story of the cowboy story about right and wrong in the eyes of God, and that totally relates to COVID-19. So the posse rides up to the church, the criminals in the church, but they cannot enter the church because it is sanctuary, it's God's church. That was understood in cowboy movies. It's no longer understood. We saw that, and I've showed you videos of pastors being arrested, people entering the church. Even in our own laws, we have specified that a government official cannot disrupt a worship service. But back in the day, they couldn't even enter the property without being invited. But now, in Alberta, we have seen church property seized. Grace Life Church property has been returned now, and they're allowed to go back after COVID restrictions are being lifted. And the church continued to meet whether the church property was seized by the government or not. But the government had the idea that they could seize the property, that they had the right to do so. In so doing, they showed that they were willing to reach in the sphere of God and to the realm of God and had no fear of God. And that continues on by degree, and that continues on to this very day. So that is directly related to what we've just gone through with COVID-19, but it's not the end. At the end of this show, I'm going to show you something that has just happened in Parliament that shows you that they intend to go much further with this at the federal level and do something very significant that's going to affect your life, especially as the outraged woke mob, the 14% of the population, begin to exercise more power in our country than what the majority of citizens are able to do. So we want to consider the implications of that. I need to re-cue that up. I lost that movie, so give me a second while I do that.
So what is law? How do we view law today?
That's not the one I want. I want this one. We're going to be getting into law next.
All right, we're going
to skip ahead on this.
So what is law? How do we...
Here we go. Sorry for the confusion here.
All right, we are going to examine
kingdoms of men
belong to the kings for people. Do you know what I mean by cowboy movies, westerns? Who's being chased comes around the corner. You'll know this intuitively. A town and set aside in that town, looking at it and studying the passages in the Scripture to help understand how God has designed this social system. We'll look at a few, and we're going to look primarily at one passage, Romans chapter 13. We're going to deal with the issue of
rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong.
Okay, let's stop for...
So Romans 13, the reason why we need to stop here is this is the passage quoted so many times over COVID-19, health restrictions, over civil rights of citizens, over the religious rights of churches and organizations. Our rights were curtailed and removed, and we were forced to do a lot of things against our will because simply the government gave itself permission to do so. And then this passage from Romans that he's looking at now was the one quoted to keep us all in line by all those churches. But were we using it correctly? Let's move on.
What are some key words in this passage? Key words that are already familiar to us. Submit.
Authority.
Authority. The authorities that exist have come from where?
Established by God.
Established by God. Let's continue.
Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing.
Boy, this is full of incredible design words. Help us understand this social system that God has given to us. Who is this king? What does Romans 13 say?
God's servant.
He is God's servant to do you good. Okay, let's look at this. We're going to deal with, first of all, in Romans chapter 13, this idea of delegation of authority and submission. Now, where do you suppose delegation of authority might come from? Where would we look, do you suppose, to find an understanding of delegation of authority? Again, remember, we must always turn and gaze upon the face of God. He is the ultimate source of all truth. And we're going to look to see, is this thing called delegation of authority found even within the Godhead? Delegation, submission. John 17. After Jesus said this, he looked toward heaven and prayed, Father, the time has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. For you granted him authority over all people, that he might give eternal life to all those you have given him. What are we reading here?
Delegation.
Delegation of authority. Isn't this interesting? Delegation of authority already bound up in the triune nature of God. That the Father delegates that authority to Jesus. For you granted him authority over all people. 1 Corinthians, then comes the end when Christ delivers the kingdom to God the Father, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. God is the one who has delegated that. Interesting. By the way, I tell people who are in management, if you do not delegate authority, if you are a micromanager, you need to turn and gaze upon the face of God, who is a great delegator of authority. Subjection? Where does that come from? When he has done this, we continue in 1 Corinthians 15, then the Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him, so that God may be all in all. We are subject to the King. Guess what? We see being subject to in the triune nature of God. We've seen it, have we not? Wives subject to their husbands, bond slaves subject to their masters, people subject to their rulers. And guess what? We see it here within the triune nature of God. Being subject to someone is not negative. And we have duties, do we not? Pay taxes, pay respect, give honor, fear God, honor the king. This is interesting to remember. What are children supposed to do to their parents?
Honor them.
Honor them. What are the citizens supposed to do to the king?
Honor.
Honor. And I just love the divine image of God stamped upon his social order. Well, let's look at this next one, purpose. What is the purpose of the state? What did we see in Romans chapter 13? What do we find here?
So he's about to talk about the purpose of the state. But as we just looked at the section about we're to honor, to obey, and to submit to the governments as an institution of God's creation. One of the things that arose during COVID-19 is the idea of rebelling. And a very American concept is to rebel and then bring change by rebellion. But God doesn't encourage us to rebel. What rebellion says is that God is not in charge of government, and because God is failing to govern our government, we must take charge and rebel and exercise that power over government, rather than to let God be sovereign over that government. Now, you can stand in opposition on truth and what is right in the eyes of God, but rebellion is a whole other thing. So our goal is not to oppose government. Our goal is to get governments to acknowledge God. And throughout history, many governments have disavowed God, want nothing to do with them. And to their shame and horror, they were brought low by God. But our job is the prophetic job to say, hey, save yourself, save your country and your people, turn back to God, and he may yet be merciful to you. But don't go this road. It's always a bad road. So let's have that spirit of acknowledging as God is really in charge. No matter what the woke crowd says, God is still in charge.
What is the purpose of the civil authority? One, you recall, he said, to punish evil. And second, to condone that which is good. Look at the context here for just a minute. What is the context of Romans chapter 13? Romans chapter 12. Let's read a few verses back in Romans chapter 12. And be wary of blurring spheres here for a minute. Verse 17. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So do we have a conflict here? God's word says that you are not to take revenge, but to leave room for God's wrath. Well, we turn to Romans chapter 13, and what does this say about the civil magistrate? That he is an agent of God's wrath. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Do you understand what God has instituted here? To you and me, who are not civil authorities, you are not to take revenge. A lynch mob is wrong, absolutely wrong. Leaving room for God's wrath, and where is that in God's institution here? Delegated to the civil authority, who is the agent of God's wrath, who does not bear the sword for nothing. Now, if God has delegated to the king the power of the sword to punish evil, Can you understand why this sphere can become the most monstrous of spheres if it is unchecked? Yes. By the way, in this delegation of authority, have you ever wondered why policemen wear uniforms? Why they wear badges? Why they take an oath of office? When I was in the Air Force, I wore a uniform. I took an oath of office. Why do we do that? The policeman cannot bear the sword. The military man cannot bear the sword unless he has been properly delegated that authority by the one to whom God has properly delegated him that authority. That is why we wear badges and take oaths of office and wear uniforms. It signifies that proper delegation of authority to bear the sword. So if the civil magistrate has been given these two purposes, to punish evil and condone what is good, then what does that imply to us? What is the implication here?
There's good and evil.
That there is good and evil.
The civil authority better know what it is.
The civil authority better know what evil is and what good is. That is exactly right. If he does not have the proper basis for calling something good or evil, I can tell you very quickly what he will decide what good is. And good will be exactly what God warned us about in 1 Samuel 8. It'll be whatever benefits the king.
Now, if that doesn't sound like today, I don't know what is. Because those in authority over us, those who have been given that power and delegated to them, are forgetting God and what is good and right in His eyes. And when they do that, we know from the Word that what will happen is they'll call good whatever benefits them, whatever serves their interests. That's what they call good, not what God has said. Oh, my friend, it is so important that we get back to God, that we understand what is good and right in His eyes, and urge our leaders to do the same, and to vote for those leaders that acknowledge that only God can tell us what is good and right and noble, and to seek His will and His kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Otherwise, we all suffer for it, and the laws become unjust. In that sphere that is right to carry the sword of punishment, of life and death over us, they will become terribly corrupt and do a great harm to you, to your family, to your community, to your nation. You might even wonder if we're a nation at all. Let's go on.
The basis of civil authority is fundamentally in the notion of ethics, what is right and what is wrong. He rules then based upon law, and every law is based in an ethical notion, answering the question, what is right and what is wrong.
Every law is based on an ethical belief about what is right and what is wrong. It's not based on feelings or opinions, but on ethics. And that ethics was given to us by God, a moral code. And that's why the Mosaic Code of Moses, the great lawgiver, shows up in every Western court throughout the Western world. You will see Moses honored as the great lawgiver. And his 10 Commandments form the foundation of almost every civilized country in the world. Even in the days of Moses, there are great sections of that the Egyptians agreed with, the Mesopotamians agreed with. It was a universal, even before it was written, that people understood it to be true. And you find elements all over the world, but never has it been culminated and brought together better than in the 10 Commandments of God, to bring it down to simple 10 commands. And that forms the basis of law. But that too is expanded by the revelation in Jesus Christ. how mercy and grace and forgiveness and restoration can go beyond the law of Moses and to redeem people and to bring them back from those things that cause us to be rebellious before the Lord. So, boy, there was a lot of material there. You can give me a call at any time and let me know what you think about that. If you need to process this information, 587-741-3031, 587-741-3031. And in fact, you may need to watch this several times because he's covered a lot of ground, a lot of critical points in scriptures that you might need to review, because this lays the foundation for everything that follows. The issue that he began with was law. And this is where he's ending with is law. Who makes the law and who gets to decide what is law? And people are telling us, well, he can do that because that's the law. And because that's the law, it's right. But a law can be wrong. And the law can violate God's law. And we have to be very careful in our discernment about that and understanding it, because primarily our job is to follow God as governments follow God. We follow the government. But if a government no longer follows God, we dare not follow that government into rebellion against God. Our goal is not to rebel against government, but our greater goal is not to rebel against God. So we can't do something immoral, not right in God's eyes, because the government makes it a law. And that's where we pick up the second part about the question of law and what role it plays.
So what is law? How do we view law today? Well, let's look.
You might not like a law, but you got to take in consideration all the people that it affects.
We are our law.
Law is rules that you follow for the benefit of all.
The laws are there to keep us safe and to keep us in line.
Evil. Law is evil.
What is law?
Any law that has no spirit behind it, we need to get rid of it.
Sometimes, honestly, I think laws are set to put people in a position not to move forward.
Law is if you got enough money.
I believe people have the right to say and do whatever they want, but just like a little child, if you give them license to do whatever they want, they grow up to not be upstanding citizens.
Law is a system of social contracts.
Ideas to the ultimate good of making our nation better.
I think there are issues of power and money, status, that end up sort of skewing the way that our government works. Even as recent as 1967, in some states, it was illegal for there to be interracial marriages.
Well, St. Paul says in the Bible that the law kills and the Spirit gives life.
If our government was going to be a better government, what would it look like?
If the government was run the way I want it, I don't think it'd work out. I wouldn't know anything about what to do or how to run it.
Well, it'd be much smaller. It would do the things that are mandated constitutionally and not whatever the popular edict of the day is.
Government should be of the people, for the people, and by the people.
The same issue of whether or not we feed poor people becomes an argument for like a week. Well, they're still going to be hungry a week later. You know? Why is this an argument based on, what side of the fence you fall on?
If it was my government, it would be different. Nothing. I wouldn't change that military a bit. Keep on going strong. Space, I'd keep that going strong.
Taxes would go to things that were more virtuous.
Lower income housing, I would change definitely.
Ideally, they would go back to the old system where we didn't have to pay to go to university.
I once heard that some politician had an indoor rainforest built for himself in Iowa.
Where I personally feel that the government can do better is if we were to redefine freedom.
I think that they make some rules without thinking.
I'd take care of ourselves before I'd be helping some other place, to be honest with you. We got enough starving people here. When governments become controlled by the rich and the powerful, then I think governments become evil.
It would be a government who truly listens to and represents the interests of all people.
If we were to have a little more discipline on people that were out of line, I think that would cause a little more control, a little more civility, and I think give us as a country a little more integrity.
Everything that's going on is going on for a reason. The government's not supposed to be perfect. There's going to be only one perfect government. It's not here yet.
I think the government is pretty good the way it is doing now, and they make some bad choices at times, but they're doing all right so far.
So when you heard that, who did you identify with? Did any of those individuals express what you believe when it comes to government? Do you think they're all right? Do you think we need more government, less government, more laws, less laws? There are a lot of laws on the book. And there's a lot of problems in our court systems. Prior to COVID-19, I did a sermon that highlighted some points about all the problems in the courts right out here in Canada. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of problems right now. And they're even more so as a result of the pandemic and the way we've approached it. There's the advance of secularism in our society, ignoring God, deciding what is right and wrong based on what benefits me, is when everything goes wrong. Because we removed God from our ethics and our understanding of good and right and pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. Let's look at the next half.
I don't know that there is any area that evokes as much passion and emotion as we find in the area of politics and government and so forth. That's interesting to me. And we'll come back and talk about that next time on our next tour. But something has happened, because the question before us is really the question of whose law is it? And where does that law come from? Because if the state begins to decide that it is the source of the ethical norm, then we will soon find ourselves in one of the most terrible situations of all, because the state bears the sword. All around the world and throughout history, you can see the atrocities that have been committed by this sphere. How did we get there?
Well, this happens again and again. And we get there because people have rejected God's law. And he's about to talk about communism. That's how we get there. And the great atrocities that have occurred as a result of rejecting God.
You follow what's happening here? When we begin to reject God as part of this system, and the king is no longer responsible to him, then the king is very soon going to begin to determine what he thinks is right. And it has resulted in the most difficult of atrocities to even imagine. Millions and millions of people destroyed, burned, murdered, buried. It's hard to conceive of those numbers. But they've come from this sphere disconnected. Rummel, in his book, Death by Government, said almost 170 million men, women, and children have been shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, or worked to death. Buried alive, drowned, hung, bombed, or killed in any other of a myriad of ways, governments have inflicted death upon unarmed, helpless citizens and foreigners. Even Voltaire, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That is what happens when you disconnect yourself from any kind of absolute truth.
Without truth, there is only manipulation. Because truth is dead, as Nietzsche saw clearly, there is only power. Now, if everything's power, then we're vulnerable to being manipulated.
The pathologies that exist within this sphere are huge. The problem with the pathologies in this sphere is that it ends up with mass graves and all kinds of other atrocities that Rummel was talking about. So, gazing upon this sphere, and we think about the pathologies, we looked at Uzziah. When the king becomes powerful, he soon begins to think that he can rule over any other sphere that he wants. 1 Samuel, God gave us the warning as to what would happen when the civil magistrate begins to believe that he is God, taking a tenth, taking the first fruits, oppressive in his taxes. I want to deal with one of these pathologies called the rise of the state. And in order to do that, I want to take you back for a minute to our third tour and answering the question, who is man? Do you remember at that time we took a look at Maslow and we took a look at Rogers in their statement about who man is. Basically, good and perfectible. That brought us to this issue, why is there evil in the world? Rogers says, experience leads me to believe that it is cultural influences which are the major factor in our evil behaviors. Maslow then said, sick people are made by a sick culture. Healthy people are made possible by a healthy culture. What did that lead us to in terms of a humanistic view of man? Basically good and perfectible. Mental health can be attained by getting in touch with yourself, self-actualization. But it was the social institutions that were the problem. Social institutions are responsible for man's evil actions. And that is why we have the kind of social actions that we have today. Because as soon as the state begins to believe that it has the right and the obligation, if these are the problems, we will invest power in this institution to help gain control of those institutions which are causing the evil in society. And the state then begins to rise in power and begin to think that it does have the right to breach the sovereign boundaries of each of those spheres. Sphere sovereignty is gone, and we have the rise of the state. And when the state begins to rise in power, it no longer observes any kind of sphere sovereignty at all, but begins to assume that it has the right to absorb all of those institutions underneath its control and power. And that then brings us to a great conflict. What is the conflict? What is the problem? It ends up being an ethical problem.
The biblical point is not that our problem ultimately is an intellectual one. It's a moral one. That's why we appeal for relativism. Because if there is no objective truth, if there are no objective standards, then it's okay for me to live however I want to live, according to my preferences. But if there is a God, and He's normative, and He has a law, then He says no when I want to say yes, and I have a conflict. If I could just get rid of objective truth, get rid of objective reality, then I can live however I want to live.
If I can just get rid of objective truth, then I can live however I want to live. What is the conflict here? What is the problem? What do we need to get rid of? God. He becomes the problem. When the state begins to rise in power, his restrictions, his ethical notions now become the problem, and we need to remove him. Now, you know you can't remove him, but the state will begin to act as if he is no longer there. And when the state begins to act as if he is no longer there, then we begin to view the state in a little different way. Look at Hegel's comment about the state. The universal is to be found in the state. The state is the divine idea that exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth, and consider that if it is difficult to comprehend nature, it is harder to grasp the essence of the state. The state is the march of God through the world. Now, I would submit to you that that is exactly what is going on. Now, we don't bow down to some statue, but we begin to act as if it is God. And we change the sphere of God and man now to state and man. That the state becomes that which we turn to answer all of our problems. The state begins to assume that it has the right over all education. It begins to assume it has the responsibility for the poor. The state begins to assume that all ethics now are bound up in the state's declaration of what is right and wrong. It assumes it will take care of the needy, of course, using your goods to do it. It will determine what wages can be paid, and it will determine what marriage looks like, and on it goes. The state rising up and assuming authority and power destroys these institutions. Father Sirico, the head of the Acton Institute, has an incredible insight as to what is happening to the family as a result of the rise of the state.
The welfare state has become a nanny state, and I think that is very sad to see the state substitute itself for the family. I don't believe that it's just the lack of these things that exist in families and then the state creates these things to meet the needs. I think it's gone beyond that. I think what has happened is the state has begun competing with the family. And you find that, almost explicitly in the kinds of programs that in effect invite men out of the home, that provide everything from A to Z for women rather than situating them within the context of families. I think the great competitor to the family today is the state, the welfare state.
Do you understand what he is saying, what Father Sirico is saying? The state then begins to compete with that sphere that God has created and the purpose and the responsibilities within that sphere. When the state begins to stand into that, and for various reasons, the family begins to be destroyed. When the state begins to act as God, and we then begin to think as God's people that the state is going to provide for me and do everything for me, we have begun to change him not only from the state that God designed and the state as God, but we soon begin to look to the state as our Savior.
We soon begin to look at the state as our Savior, as our God, and we start worshiping the state. You might even be a Christian or in a church, but if you're looking to the government to deliver you, you're not looking to God. We have forgotten the realms that the government can't do what God does. It will fail. It will do miserably. If in the past we are troubled by government schools in tribal countries, so much so that nations that we don't want to have Canada Day, we are not moving away from that. We are moving towards that, where the government continues to violate the rights and the God-given realms of responsibility of every human being, and will continue to do more so as we walk away from God. The problem is not being sensitive or respecting other people, but not having the government under God, where it can do whatever it wants, and whatever it does will be in its own best interest, not the interest of the people, not to the interest ethics based on some higher moral code. It'll be based on self-interest. It always has been, always will be. That's the pattern throughout history, and today is no different than that. I want to pause this and move on, because there has been some recent developments that are very important in Canada that impacts us in our belief about what is going on and how we've given an immense amount of power to the government. And as of this week, they have just written new laws and given themselves more power. You might not have heard this story. This might be the first time you heard of it. Here it is. I want you to consider this.
The Trudeau government is trying to take cancel culture and turn it into federal law. I'm Candace Malcolm, and this is The Candace Malcolm Show. Midnight madness. As Canadians slept, the Liberals, NDP, and Bloc combined to pass Bill C-10. That is how Canadian law professor and the country's foremost expert on law and technology, Dr. Michael Geist, described last Tuesday's shenanigans in the House of Commons that saw the Trudeau government ram through its controversial internet censorship bill. This comes after we saw the government limiting debate, overruling its own committee chair, and using every available procedural maneuver to get the bill passed in the House of Commons, Geist reports. In a nutshell, Bill C-10 attempts to take the government's outdated cultural regulatory mechanism, the CRTC, and awkwardly apply it onto the internet. This will give bureaucrats, and the political operatives who direct them, the power to meddle in the content that you see online. The bill seeks to regulate everything from Facebook to Netflix to Google, and potentially replace those companies' algorithms with the government-approved ones. This would allow the feds to push content they like and hide content they don't like. This should make all Canadians feel uneasy. The idea of liberal hacks in the Prime Minister's office getting to decide what you see and what you don't puts Canada in uncomfortably close proximity to totalitarian China. Even if you agree with the Liberals today, would you trust that power in the hands of Conservatives? Or how about the NDP? Given the power to control the information on the internet, should we ever trust a political party with this kind of power? Perhaps the most concerning element of Bill C-10 was an amendment that was removed by the Liberals that would have protected user-generated content. In other words, the Liberals want to regulate and control what you post on your private Facebook page or your private Twitter account. And it turns out that Bill C-10 was just the tip of the iceberg of the Trudeau government's plans to control what you see and what you say online. Speaking recently at the Banff World Media Festival, Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault hinted that the Liberals had something far worse coming. And this is a quote from Guilbeault. He says, "Now this is going to be controversial. People think that C-10 was controversial. Wait until we table this legislation," he said, doing his very best impression of a Bond villain. Well, lo and behold, less than 24 hours after the Liberals rammed through Bill C-10, Justice Minister David Lametti introduced Bill C-36, which is a bill to crack down on so-called hate propaganda, hate crimes, and hate speech online. Lametti tabled the last-minute bill on Wednesday, right before the House of Commons rose for the summer, which, among other things, will reintroduce hate speech provisions into the Canadian Human Rights Act. It will become illegal if this bill is passed to communicate in a way that, quote, is likely to foment detestation or vilification of an individual or a group. Now, when it comes to Bill C-36, I'm going to read from Matthew Lau's piece over in the National Post because he describes it very well. He says, quote, "Under the hate speech provisions, journalists, bloggers, and social media users, in fact, almost anyone who writes anything on the internet, would be liable if anyone complains that their speech is hateful, to be investigated by bureaucrats for committing human rights violations and forced to pay reparations." All reasonable people can agree, of course, that stirring up hatred against someone or some group of people is very bad. But unfortunately, these sorts of hate speech laws are rife with pitfalls. There is, first of all, the moral hazard problem. Similarly to how extravagant government welfare programs discourage people from earnestly searching for jobs, entitling people to financial reparations if they complain about hate speech creates the possibility that some people will originate complaints even when they are poorly founded, since the complainants do not face any downside financial risk. Now, I'll continue to read from Lau's piece in the National Post. He writes, "Perhaps to allay concerns about censorship, the government says that speech that expresses dislike or disdain, that discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends, is not considered hate speech and so would not be illegal. But what is the difference between speech that expresses hatred and speech that merely expresses dislike? In a society governed by laws, people should be able to know whether something is lawful before they do it. With the proposed hate speech law, people instead will find out after the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal reaches its decision whether their speech was illegal or not. The process does not inspire confidence, especially since under Section 13 there were secret trials, and until one case in 2009, the tribunal's conviction rate over a period of 3 decades was 100%. So again, to Lau's point, what constitutes hate speech? What's the difference between speech that expresses dislike, disdain, that discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offend, which the government says is legal, versus hate speech, which the government says is illegal? Make no mistake, Bill C-36 will expand the government's power to crack down on messages and comments they don't like, based on their own subjective and ill-defined criteria. First, Trudeau introduced an internet censorship bill to give the feds regulatory power over the internet. Now, with this bill, they want to criminalize opinions they don't like. Perhaps worst of all is the mechanism that could be used to pull down content the government doesn't like. Bill C-36 gives the Canadian Human Rights Commission the power to compel citizens to cease online communication or pay a monetary fine. Compelling Canadians to remove content under threat of fine or worse is only part of what the Trudeau government has already told us is their ultimate goal. After Trudeau won a minority election in 2019, his mandate letter written to Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault laid out his top priorities in government. In that letter, Trudeau ordered the government to, quote, create new regulations for social media platforms, starting with a requirement that all platforms remove illegal content, including hate speech, within 24 hours or face significant penalties, unquote. Removing content the Liberals don't like, and in 24 hours no less, erases any possibility for due process or appeal. It allows the government to play judge and jury and to compel technology companies to do their dirty work. Make no mistake, these are censorship laws, and censorship laws have no place in a free and open society. I'm Candace Malcolm, and this is The Candace Malcolm Show.
So there you go. Right off the bat, Bill C-10 is passed, and C-36 is on its way. And free speech is out the window. They're going to, what you post on Facebook with C-36 is going to be regulated. And you'll be compelled to remove if they find it doesn't match what they want said. Is this what we talked about earlier, government overreach? Are they going beyond into the realm of God and assuming the role of God in our lives, telling us the way we should think, what we should say, and how we should express it, and punishing us if we don't comply and think and say and act in the way they want? That's where we're going. They're in control. They have taken the position of God. And will we be in agreement with that? Will we comply and say, yes, they have the right to be God in our lives? I think Canada is very different than that. I don't think we were founded on those principles. And I don't think people who have come here from other countries in the world where governments behave that way is what they want to find when they come to this country. They want to find freedom. And that can only come when we acknowledge God and controls our less than wonderful nature, especially in the realm of government. I hope this whole series has caused you to think about Canada. I still believe Canada is one of the best countries in the world and has a great potential and can do a lot more good in this world, in God's eyes. But we have to do a better job at vetting our leaders and people who we are voting for, take more responsibility and seeing if their worldview acknowledges of God or are they working against God's plans. Because no nation can stand if they rebel against God, His laws, His truth and His grace, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. May God bless you. May God bless our country as we seek His will in our life.
Come to God's country. Come to God's people. Come to God's Word. Welcome to Millerville Community Church. We're just a short drive away.